My family, or rather, the entire Willow Creek Estate's HOA board, feasted on prime rib under crystal chandeliers, while the only thing served to me was a check they called community support. They told me to be grateful for the crumbs from their empire, unaware that the amount on that paper was merely a fraction of the interest they had been paying me every single month. Tonight, amid their sneers about community standards, I would turn my laptop around and force them to look at their own debt statement for the very first time. My name is Avery Thompson, and for as long as I could remember, my presence in this gated paradise had been tolerated rather than desired. I was the glitch in their perfect pastel subdivision, the anomaly who refused to conform to the ruthless pursuit of fines and control that defined the Willow Creek way of life. Tonight was no different. We were seated in the private ballroom of the clubhouse, a building so exclusive it didn't need a sign, just a 10-foot iron gate and a keypad that only the chosen few could access. Located in the heart of the subdivision where the manicured lawns rolled like green profit charts. The walls were lined with velvet. The air smelled of aged oak, fresh-cut roses, and the faint metallic tang of power. The silence was broken only by the polite clinking of silver against bone china. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, a position that felt less like a seat and more like exile. Around me, the air shimmered with the invisible static of HOA supremacy. Board member Derek wore a watch that cost more than my annual salary at the Sunbridge Community Legal Project. His wife Lana was draped in a dress that looked spun from liquid diamonds, her laughter sharp as she recounted her latest victory, fining old Mr. Patel for having a flag that was 1 inch too wide. And then there was me. I wore the same simple black dress I'd bought off the rack 3 years ago. My hair was pulled back in a functional bun. My hands rested quietly in my lap. No diamond tennis bracelet caught the light. No story about a private jet. Just silence and patience. Victoria Langford, the architect of this little empire and the woman who currently held the lease on my self-esteem, tapped her crystal flute with a dessert spoon. The sound was delicate, but it commanded immediate obedience. Conversation died instantly. Waiters froze like ghosts. Victoria stood up. She was a woman who took up space even when seated, her presence expanded by the sheer force of her ego. She smoothed the lapels of her tailored blazer, looking down the table at her creation, her board, her loyal residents smiling with the benevolence of a queen surveying her subjects. "To the community," Victoria said, her voice a rich contralto that had charmed city council members and intimidated residents for 15 years. "And not just to the lawns we share, but to the standards we enforce. The world outside these gates is chaotic, full of people who let their grass grow an inch too long, who hang flags on the wrong day, who complain about unfair rules. But in Willow Creek, we have order. We have standards. We have people who understand that perfection isn't wished for, it's fined into existence." She raised her glass higher. "To those who know how to keep the neighborhood perfect. Here, here," Derek shouted, raising his glass with too much enthusiasm. "To the Empire," Lana added, winking at her cousin Marcus on the board. I lifted my glass of water, slow and deliberate. I didn't drink. I just watched them. They were so loud, so confident, so utterly convinced of their own invincibility. They bragged about record fine collections, 6 figures this quarter alone. They discussed enforcement actions like trading baseball cards. Derek was laughing about how he'd squeezed Mrs. Alvarez until she painted her front door the exact shade of willow white or faced daily fines. Lana turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were predatory, but she masked it with a veneer of sisterly concern that was far more dangerous. "And how are things in the trenches, Avery?" she asked, voice pitched just loud enough to cut through the chatter. "Still working at that little Sunbridge place? Helping people fight perfectly reasonable rules?" I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Sunbridge Community Legal Project. Yes. We just helped 40 families appeal unfair citations so they wouldn't lose their homes over a basketball hoop. The table went quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when someone brings a wet dog into a ballroom. Lana covered her mouth in feigned shock. 40 families? How adorable. Really? So sweet how you try. But tell me, Avery, what does a fine look like for those people? $50? $100? Do you make them sign a petition with their toaster as collateral? A ripple of laughter went through the room. Marcus chimed in, leaning forward. Hey, don't knock it, Lana. Avery's the saint of Willow Creek. While we're out here doing the heavy lifting, keeping the neighborhood on the cover of HOA Monthly, she's down in the mud making sure the little guys can keep their ugly lawn gnomes one more week. It's charitable. It's a tax write-off in human form. The laughter grew louder. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Not shame, but a burning cold anger that settled deep in my stomach. They thought my work was a joke. They thought Sunbridge was a hobby where I could pretend to be useful while they did the real work of neighborhood capitalism. It's not about the size of the fine, Lana, I said, voice steady though my heart hammered. It's about giving people a chance to breathe. It's about fixing the mess that overzealous enforcement creates. Overzealous, Derek scoffed, tearing into his medium-rare ribeye. That's rich coming from you, Avery. You call it bullying. We call it market efficiency. If people can't read the 30-page covenant, that's natural selection, not a tragedy. Victoria cleared her throat, signaling that the comedy portion was over. She gestured to the head waiter, a man with graying hair who held a silver tray. On it sat a single white envelope. The waiter walked the length of the table. Everyone knew where he was going. This was the ritual, the quarterly ceremony of humiliation Victoria performed like clockwork. The waiter stopped at my right side and placed the envelope on the clean white tablecloth in front of me. It looked so innocent. But inside was a check Victoria had written personally. Go on, Avery, she said, smile tight and patronizing. Open it. It's your quarterly support. The HOA takes care of its own, even the ones who insist on planting unauthorized tomatoes. I didn't reach for it immediately. I stared at the stark white rectangle. We call it the Compliance Fund, Marcus whispered to Lana, eliciting giggles. No, Victoria corrected, eyes locking on mine. I call it scrap money because that's exactly what it is, isn't it, Avery? The scraps from the feast. The little bits that fall off the table while the rest of us are eating. But you need to eat too, don't you? The cruelty was breathtaking. She didn't say it with malice. She said it with the casual arrogance of someone who believed she was being generous. She truly believed that without her scrap money I would dissolve into the chaos I worked to prevent. Derek leaned back, swirling his wine. You should be grateful, Avery. Most residents in your position, single, driving a 10-year-old sedan, living in a townhouse the size of my walk-in closet, would kill for those scraps. A person who doesn't know how to follow rules should at least know how to say thank you when she's fed crumbs from the table of the righteous. Right? Neighbor, be grateful for scraps. The phrase hung in the air, suspended in the scent of expensive meat and old wine. I looked at Derek. I looked at Lana. I looked at Victoria. They were waiting for me to bow my head. They were waiting for the mumbled thank you, the flush of embarrassment, the submission. They wanted me to pick up the envelope and tuck it into my purse like a thief, validating their superiority. I reached out and placed my hand on the envelope. The paper felt cool under my fingertips. Thank you, Victoria, I said. My voice did not shake. I appreciate the help. Good girl, Victoria said, satisfied. She turned her attention back to her ribeye. Now, on to more serious business. Once we finish dessert, I want to discuss a little restructuring I've been planning. The market is shifting, interest rates are climbing, and we need to tighten the ship. I'm thinking it's time to revisit the distribution of community resources and the support payments. We need to make sure the funds are going to the residents who are actively contributing to the perfection of Willow Creek. Just a little recalibration for fairness. She didn't look at me when she said it, but the implication was as subtle as a sledgehammer. She was going to cut me off. Or worse, she was going to try to force me to sign away the small voting rights my late neighbor Evelyn had left me in exchange for continued reduced support. She was going to squeeze me out completely, framing it as fairness. Sounds smart, Vicky, Derek said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. Trim the fat. Trim the fat. That was me. I was the fat. I sat there feeling the weight of the envelope under my palm. Inside, I knew the check would be for exactly $4,500. It was enough to cover my utilities and my car payment for a few months. To them, it was the price of a new pair of designer sunglasses. But they didn't know the version of Avery that actually existed. They didn't know that for the last 5 years I had not spent a single cent of their scrap money on anything but investments. They didn't know that I lived modestly not because I had to, but because I chose to keep my overhead low. They didn't know that every check Victoria had given me, every insult packaged as charity, had been deposited directly into a high-yield account. And they certainly didn't know about Northline. Victoria continued to lecture the table about the importance of leverage, about how debt was a tool for the strong to use against the weak. She talked about the upcoming maturity of the clubhouse renovation loan, dismissing it with a wave of her manicured hand. Brightshore Bank will roll those over. They always do. We are Willow Creek Estates. We dictate the terms, not the bank. I took a sip of water to hide the small involuntary twitch at the corner of my mouth. We dictate the terms. Oh, Victoria, if only you knew. My phone buzzed against my thigh, hidden beneath the napkin on my lap. It was a single sharp vibration. I knew exactly what time it was. It was 8 p.m. The markets were closed, but the legal teams had been working overtime. I glanced down, shielding the screen. It was an email from the secure server of Northline Renewal Fund. The subject line was short, devoid of emotion, and beautiful in its finality. All documents signed. You're now the primary secured creditor. I stared at the words. The laughter of the board, the clinking of silverware, the drone of Victoria's voice receded into a dull hum. Primary secured creditor. Victoria thought she was sitting at the head of the table. She thought she was the empress of this room. She didn't realize that the chair she was sitting on, the clubhouse we were eating in, and the vast majority of the community amenities she was so proud of now effectively belonged to the woman she had just accused of eating crumbs. She was right about one thing, though. Debt was a weapon. She just didn't know I was holding the gun. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked up. Victoria was raising her glass again, proposing a toast to the future. To the future? I whispered, my hand resting gently on the envelope of scrap money. Did you say something, Avery? Lana asked, raising an eyebrow. I said, to the future, I replied. And for the first time that night, I smiled. It was a genuine smile. I had a feeling it was going to be very interesting. Victoria laughed. That's the spirit, Avery. Maybe one day you'll understand what it takes to build a perfect community. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I already do. The waiter arrived with the dessert menus. The air smelled of caramelized sugar and victory. The show was about to begin. They had served me humiliation for dinner, but I had a feeling the dessert course was going to be entirely mine. I tapped my finger against the envelope. $4,500 scrap money. I wondered how much she would pay to save her empire. Staring at the white envelope Victoria had just placed on the tablecloth, the one containing my so-called scrap money, I felt a familiar phantom weight settle in my chest. It was not the weight of gratitude. It was the crushing gravity of memory. The envelope was not new. The check inside was fresh, signed with today's date. But the gesture itself was ancient. It was a ritual that had started 8 years ago when I first moved into Willow Creek. My mind drifted back to my first HOA board meeting in the same clubhouse. I was 32, freshly divorced, trying to start over in a place that promised safety and perfection. Victoria had been president even then. Mornings in that room were not about welcome. They were about strategy. We sat at a table long enough to land a small aircraft on, silverware heavy enough to bruise egos. I remembered one specific Tuesday in June. Derek, then vice president, was stabbing at his grapefruit while Victoria read the covenant violations report. Straight A's in compliance again. Derek, Victoria had said, not looking up from the paper. Good. We need that brain sharp. When you turn in your next term, the president's parking spot is yours, but only if you spend the summer shadowing the enforcement team. Deal, Derek had grinned. Then Victoria had turned to Lana. And my little enforcer, your husband tells me you want to lead the paint committee. 10,000 for new swatches and signage. You look good in authority, and appearances matter. Done. Then the paper lowered. Her eyes, pale blue and unblinking, landed on me. I was sitting quietly reading the resident handbook, trying to be invisible. Avery, she said. I looked up. Yes, Mrs. Langford. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small beige envelope. She slid it across the polished mahogany. Stopped just short of my water glass. Open it. Inside were 3 crisp $20 bills. $60. That's for your first quarter, she said. You're not like the others. You're quieter. You don't have their drive. So you need to learn to manage what little compliance credit you have. Make it last. But Lana gets to lead the committee, I whispered, the injustice burning my throat. Lana has potential to marry into more influence, Victoria said matter-of-factly. Derek has the potential to run this board. You, Avery, you have the potential to be very content with very little. Learn to budget. That was the first time I felt it, the distinct categorization. There were the assets, Derek and Lana. And then there was me, the liability, the expense line item. 2 years later, the phrase scrap money was officially coined. I had asked to skip a gala because I volunteered to help organize a neighborhood book drive for low-income families outside the gates. You want to sort through dirty used paperbacks instead of attending the people who pay for the roof over your head? Victoria had asked, adjusting her pearls in the foyer. It helps people read. Victoria, I had argued. It's important. She had laughed then, a short barking sound. You think sorting books is important? You think that is work. Real work is extracting compliance. Avery. Real work is building leverage. If you want to live your life picking through other people's refuse, go ahead. But don't expect a seat at the banquet. You can live off the scraps. Be grateful for scraps. It became the soundtrack of my life in Willow Creek. But Victoria made a miscalculation. She thought she was the only influence in that community. She forgot about Evelyn. My late neighbor Evelyn Harrington, no relation to my old life, just a kind widow in the corner house, was the founder of the original homeowners group before it became this monster. By the time I knew her, she was frail, bound to a wheelchair in her sunroom, but her mind was a steel trap. The board treated her like a relic, a mascot to be wheeled out for photo ops and then ignored. But I spent my evenings with her. While Derek was out writing tickets and Lana was crying over swatch books, I was in Evelyn's sunroom, surrounded by dust motes and leather-bound covenant ledgers. Come here, little mouse, she would say, her voice raspy. Victoria thinks you are dull because you don't scream for attention. She is a fool. Loud rules are stupid rules. Quiet rules are dangerous rules. She didn't teach me how to bake cookies. She taught me how to read a balance sheet. Look at this, she would say, pointing a gnarled finger at the community financials. This is not just numbers, Avery. This is a story. Assets are what you own. Liabilities are what own you. Victoria loves liabilities because she calls them leverage. She thinks debt is a ladder. But if you stand on a ladder that is rotting, you don't climb, you fall. She turned the balance sheet into a puzzle game. Find the leak, she would challenge. I would trace the lines. The maintenance costs on the clubhouse are too low compared to depreciation. They aren't fixing things. They are letting the building rot to claim the tax loss and keep fines high. Evelyn would cackle, delighted. Sharp. Very sharp. You see what others miss because you actually look. Derek only looks at the fine line. You look at the cost. By the time Evelyn passed, I knew I had a gift. Numbers sang to me. Patterns emerged from chaos. I understood the flow of HOA capital better than I understood neighborhood politics. I naively thought this skill would finally earn me Victoria's respect. I remembered walking into her office the summer before I started at Sunbridge. I was holding my proposal. Victoria, I said, standing tall. I want to volunteer on the finance committee. Not just filing papers. I want to work in compliance analysis. I've been tracking the books and I think the commercial loan on the clubhouse is overextended. Victoria looked at me over her reading glasses. She didn't look proud. She looked amused. Analysis? Avery, honey, let's be realistic. You are good with details, organization, but high-level analysis requires a certain killer instinct. You are too soft. You care too much about the why and not enough about the how much we can find. I can do it, I insisted. I have a better spot for you, she said, waving her hand. The welcome desk at the front gate. We need a face. Someone polite, someone who can smile and hand out violation notices. It will teach you humility and keep you close to the community without risking anything. So I became the welcome desk attendant, the fancy receptionist, as Lana called it. I wore a headset. I greeted new residents. I fetched coffee for board members who were half as smart as me but made 50 times my influence. But being invisible had its perks. People say things in front of welcome desk attendants that they would never say in a board meeting. They think we are furniture. One afternoon, late in August, Victoria and Derek walked past my desk. They didn't even glance at me. They were laughing. The beauty of the fine-to-own scheme, Victoria was saying, her voice carrying in the marble lobby, is that they never actually win. We set the late fee so high that 90% of them default in year 3. We keep the citation, we tow their cars, and we start over with a new resident. It's a perpetual income machine. And legal? Derek asked, sounding impressed. Perfectly, Victoria replied. It's in the fine print. If they could read the covenant, they wouldn't sign. But they're desperate. Desperation is the highest margin product we sell. Derek. I sat there, my hand frozen on the phone receiver. I felt sick. The numbers Evelyn had taught me, the clean, logical beauty of community finance, were being twisted into a weapon to flay the residents. Victoria wasn't just a president. She was a predator. And by extension, the roof over my head, the grass under my feet, it was all paid for by that desperation. That was the crack in the foundation. That was the moment I realized I couldn't just inherit this community. I had to escape it or destroy it. A few months later, Evelyn passed. Her funeral was a grotesque parade of false mourning. Victoria gave a eulogy about her Titan spirit and her love for order. She turned her into a caricature of control to justify her own. But before she died, she gave me one last lesson. It was a stormy night. She summoned me to her bedside. Avery, she whispered, pressing a heavy envelope into my hands. This is yours. Not the trust the board controls. This is mine. Personal voting proxies and a lien note on the clubhouse loan. Non-voting for now, but they exist. Evelyn, I don't want... Hush, she snapped. They will try to buy you out. They will tell you it's worthless paper. Do not sign. Do not sell. Keep it. One day you will understand the game better than they do. When that day comes, this is your key. Don't let them bully you out of the room. I hid the envelope in the lining of my old suitcase. I never spoke of it. I went to work at Sunbridge. I studied finance at night. I graduated top of my certification class. When I brought my diploma home, placed it on Victoria's desk hoping for a well done, she barely glanced at it. Good, she said. Now you have the credentials. We can find you a husband on the board or maybe a role handing out welcome packets. We need someone to handle the violation notices. It was devastatingly clear. To them, my degree was an accessory. They saw my intelligence as a cute trick. I looked at the scrap money envelope in the clubhouse tonight. Now, 38, looking at Victoria, I felt the ghost of that 32-year-old woman standing in the foyer, being told to go sort dirty books. They thought I was still her. They thought I was the girl who needed their $60 to buy compliance stickers. They thought I was the welcome desk attendant who fetched coffee and didn't understand what a balloon payment meant. They didn't know that the girl who sorted books had grown up to read dirty ledgers. They didn't know that the welcome desk attendant had memorized the names of every shell company they discussed in the lobby. And they certainly didn't know that Evelyn's little envelope of voting proxies was no longer sitting in a suitcase. It had been leveraged, collateralized, and reinvested. I looked around the table. Derek was texting under the table. Lana was checking her reflection in a spoon. Victoria was signaling for more wine. They were so comfortable in their disdain. They felt safe because they believed the hierarchy was natural law. Bored at the top, loyal residents like Lana as ornaments, and failures like Avery at the bottom, eating crumbs. I picked up the envelope. I didn't open it. I just tapped it against the table. A slow rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. Be grateful for scraps. I thought, oh, I was grateful. I was incredibly grateful because if they had fed me properly, if they had given me a seat at the table and a board position, I might have become just like them. I might have become soft. But they starved me. And hunger, as Evelyn always said, is the only thing that really sharpens the mind. You're drifting off, Avery. Derek sneered, breaking my reverie. Dreaming about how to spend your $4,000. A new welcome mat, perhaps. Something like that, I said softly, my fingers curling around the paper. Just thinking about investments. Investments. Victoria snorted into her wine glass. Cute. I looked at her. Really looked at her. And for the first time I didn't see a giant. I saw a woman standing on a rotting ladder holding a hammer, thinking she was building when all she was really doing was knocking out her own supports. And I was the termite in the wood. The transition from the theoretical purity of my Sunbridge certification to the practical brutality of Willow Creek HOA was not a slide. It was a collision. I started as a junior compliance auditor in the Internal Records Division, a role I had fought for, refusing the soft landing of welcome desk duty that Lana would have happily accepted. I wanted to see the engine room. For the first 6 months I was a ghost in the machine, crunching numbers in a windowless office on the second floor of the clubhouse, surrounded by board members who smelled of stale coffee and entitlement. They ignored me, assuming I was just there to pad my resume before marrying a compliant husband. Their indifference was my cover. It was during a routine audit of the community amenities portfolio that I found the special purpose vehicles. They were buried deep in the subledgers, innocuous-sounding entities like Willow Horizon Partners and Apex Enforcement LLC. On the surface, they looked like standard holding companies for specific maintenance projects. But when I traced the cash flows, the pattern was terrifying. These companies existed solely to house bad debt, the massive clubhouse renovation loan that Victoria and Derek had taken out 5 years ago when rates were near zero. They were transferring toxic obligations off the main HOA balance sheet and into these shadow entities. It made Willow Creek look profitable and lean to potential buyers while the rot was simply being hidden in the basement. I spent 3 nights verifying my findings. I built a model showing what would happen if the Federal Reserve raised interest rates by even half a percentage point. The cost of servicing that hidden debt would skyrocket. The SPVs would default. And because the main HOA had guaranteed those loans in the fine print, the contagion would wipe out community liquidity in 90 days. I wrote a memo. It was 10 pages long, dense with charts and projections. I titled it Exposure Risk and Solvency Projections in High-Interest Scenarios. I printed it on heavy bond paper and walked into Derek's office. Derek was sitting behind a desk made of glass that cost more than my tuition. He was throwing a stress ball against the wall, looking bored. "What is this, Avery?" he asked, flipping through the pages without reading a single word. "It's a warning," I said, my voice tight. "We are over-leveraged. Derek, you're hiding almost $40 million of bad debt in those SPVs. If the prime rate shifts, we are insolvent." Derek laughed, a genuine belly laugh. He tossed the memo into the recycling bin. "Insolvent," he repeated, wiping a tear from his eye. "You've been reading too many textbooks, neighbor. That debt isn't a liability. It's creative accounting. It's how the grown-ups play the game. We keep the fine revenue up. We get our bonuses. And the bank looks the other way because they're making fees on the transactions. Everyone wins. But the risk? The only risk," he interrupted, voice dropping to a cold tone, "is having a nervous little girl running around shouting fire in a crowded subdivision. Don't worry your pretty head about leverage. Leave the heavy lifting to the board." 2 days later, I was transferred. I wasn't fired, that would have been too messy. Instead, Victoria reassigned me to the Public Relations Department. My title was Community Liaison Officer. It was a non-job. My duties consisted of wearing tailored suits, standing next to Victoria at ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new speed bumps, and smiling at residents while they signed violation notices they should have rejected. I became a prop. I was the soft, feminine face of an HOA that was systematically devouring its own residents. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. I had just finished a photo shoot for the annual report. Standing in a hard hat pointing at a blueprint I had never seen before, I walked back into the lobby of the clubhouse. There was a commotion near the security desk. A woman was crying. She was small, wearing a faded coat, clutching a sheath of crumpled papers. 2 large security guards were blocking her path. "I paid," she was screaming, her voice cracking. "I paid on the 1st. I have the receipt." I stopped. I knew I should keep walking. That's what a compliant resident does. We ignore the noise. But I couldn't. I walked over. "What is the problem here?" I asked, flashing my badge. The guards hesitated. "She's causing a disturbance. Ms. Thompson. She was cited from the Oak Lane block this morning, and she's trying to see the property manager." The woman looked at me, eyes red and desperate. "Please, miss, I have a baby. They changed the locks while I was at work. My baby's formula is inside. I paid my HOA dues. Look." She thrust a money order receipt at me. It was dated the 1st of the month. The amount was correct, $1,200. "Why was she cited if she paid?" I asked the guard. He shrugged. "System flagged a default. She missed the processing fee." I looked at the paperwork. There it was in microscopic print on page 14 of her covenant agreement, a digital processing fee of $12.50. Because she had paid by money order instead of direct deposit, the fee applied. She hadn't included the $12. So the system counted the entire payment as incomplete. Incomplete meant default. Default meant citation and lockout. Willow Creek HOA had kicked a mother and her infant onto the street over $12.50. "Let her back in," I said, my voice shaking. "Call the site manager. Tell them to unlock her door." I will pay the fee. Can't do that, miss, the guard said, face impassive. Once the citation is executed, the unit is listed as non-compliant. Maintenance has probably already cleared it out. It's board policy, no exceptions. She has a baby, I whispered. She should have read the covenant, he said. Then he took the woman by the arm and began to drag her toward the revolving doors. She screamed, a raw animal sound of absolute powerlessness. I stood there in my Italian wool suit, holding my leather portfolio, watching the HOA's private army throw a woman into the cold because of a computer algorithm designed to maximize turnover. I did not go back to my office. I went to the elevator, rode it down to the parking garage, got into my car, and drove. I drove for 3 hours until I ran out of gas. The next morning I resigned from the welcome desk. I did not do it by email. I walked into Victoria's office and placed my badge on her desk. I'm done, I said. Victoria didn't look up from her paperwork. Done with what, the PR project? We can move you to violation intake. Done with this, I said, gesturing to the room, to the building, to her. Done with the lies. Done with the cruelty. I quit. She finally looked at me. Her expression was not angry. It was disappointed, like she had bought a show dog that refused to perform. You are making a mistake, Avery. This is a tantrum. You are emotional. I am ethical, I corrected him. Ethics are a luxury for people who can afford them, she sneered. If you walk out that door, you are on your own. No community perks, no priority snow removal, no expense account. You think you can survive out there? You have never paid a fine without my waiver. Watch me, I said. The fallout was immediate and nuclear. Victoria called it compliance suicide. She told the board I was taking a sabbatical for mental health reasons. Derek laughed so hard he choked when I told him I had accepted a full-time role at Sunbridge. You're going to work for the losers? He asked. The people who help the people we cite. That's rich, Avery. You are literally going to the other side of the food chain. Enjoy the smell. Lana was more subtle. She posted a story on the community Facebook page. A photo of her sipping champagne on the clubhouse deck with the caption, "Some people are built for the gates. Others are built for the dirt. Sad to see my neighbor chose the mud." I moved out of the welcome desk apartment that weekend. I rented a modest townhouse in the same neighborhood my board would have described as transitional. It was 850 square feet. The radiator clattered like a dying engine every time the heat kicked on. The view was a brick wall and a dumpster, but it was mine. My salary at Sunbridge was $42,000 a year. That was less than what I used to spend on compliance stickers. And then came the scrap money, a month after I left. I received a notification from the HOA trust. Victoria had restructured the payouts because I was no longer an active participant in the community board. My monthly distribution was cut by 95%. It was reduced to $4,500 a month. It was a calculated insult. It was enough money to keep me from starving. Enough to make them feel generous, but low enough to remind me exactly where I stood. It was an allowance for a child. Something happened to me at Sunbridge. The office was a converted warehouse smelling of toner and damp coats. My desk was a folding table. My colleagues were overworked legal aides and retired accountants who wore cardigans with holes in the elbows. But the work was real. I wasn't moving numbers around to hide debt anymore. I was sitting across from a single mother who needed help fighting an eviction over a $12 processing fee. I was helping a retired teacher refinance a predatory HOA lien that was charging her 300% in compounded fines. I saw the other side of the ledger. I saw the people Victoria called liabilities, and I realized they were the only ones actually generating value. They worked. They built. They served. The board just leached off them. I began to see finance not as a weapon of extraction but as a tool for repair. And I began to study. Every night after I finished my shift at Sunbridge, I went back to my tiny, noisy townhouse. I sat at my second-hand desk, ate ramen noodles that cost 30 cents a pack, and I opened my laptop. I didn't spend the scrap money. I didn't spend the extra money from my salary. I lived on $20 a day. Everything else, every single cent of the $4,500 from Victoria, every spare dollar from my paycheck went into a brokerage account I had opened under a generic LLC name. I didn't buy stocks. Stocks were for gamblers. I bought debt. I started small. Municipal bonds from struggling subdivisions. Distressed HOA paper from communities that had good fundamentals but bad boards. I read prospectuses that were 200 pages long. I found the inefficiencies that the big banks ignored because the deals were too small for them. My board thought I was suffering when I showed up to community meetings wearing the same dress 3 years in a row. Lana would smirk when I drove up in my 10-year-old Honda with a dent in the bumper. Derek would make a joke about the poverty aesthetic. They saw a woman who had failed. They saw a resident who had fallen out of the gates and hit the pavement. They didn't see the spreadsheets I kept on my encrypted hard drive. They didn't see that my portfolio was outperforming the S&P 500 by 12% annually. They didn't see that I wasn't just surviving. I was accumulating ammunition. I was learning the anatomy of their world from the bottom up. I learned how a missed payment of $12 could destroy a life. And I learned that if you bought enough of those $12 debts, you didn't just own the paper, you owned the board that wrote it. Victoria thought she was punishing me with her scraps. She didn't realize she was funding her own executioner. Every check she signed was another bullet in my chamber. And I was very patient. I would collect every scrap, every crumb, every penny of their condescension, and I would forge it into a blade. The townhouse was cold and the sirens outside were loud. But for the first time in my life, I slept soundly because I knew something they didn't. I knew that empires don't fall because of armies. They fall because of termites. And I was already eating the wood. It started with a citation notice on a rusted mailbox in a block Victoria wouldn't drive through without locking her doors. It was a Tuesday afternoon at Sunbridge. The fluorescent lights were humming their usual headache-inducing tune. I was staring at a case file for a property called the Highland Arms, a crumbling brick townhouse block on the east side of the subdivision, home to 40 families who were about to be put on the street because the HOA had defaulted on the commercial mortgage for the shared amenities. My job was simple. I had to audit the building's financials to see if Sunbridge could intervene with an emergency bridge loan. I flipped through the stack of legal documents, my eyes scanning for the owner of record. I expected to see a slumlord name or perhaps a faceless holding company based in Delaware. What I saw was Summit Horizon Partners, LLC. My breath hitched. The name triggered a synapse in the back of my brain, a dormant memory from my 6 months in the auditing dungeon at the clubhouse. Summit Horizon. It sounded generic, boring, corporate, but I remembered the font. I remembered the specific law firm listed as the registered agent. I opened my laptop and dug into my encrypted archives, the personal backups I had made before I walked out of Victoria's office 2 years ago. I ran a search for Summit Horizon. Popped up immediately. It was a special purpose vehicle created 4 years ago. Its sole purpose was to acquire distressed assets in working-class blocks. But here was the kicker. The signatory on the incorporation documents wasn't Victoria Langford. It wasn't Derek. It was the chief financial officer of Willow Creek HOA. Victoria owned the Highland Arms, but she didn't own it directly. She owned it through 3 layers of shell companies designed to insulate the main board from the bad press of citing 40 low-income families. I felt a surge of nausea, followed quickly by the cold, electric hum of curiosity. If Victoria owned this building, why was she letting it go into foreclosure? The mortgage on it was only $3 million. That was pocket change for her. That was less than the cost of the renovation on her summer house in the Hamptons. I looked closer at the foreclosure filing. The plaintiff, the entity foreclosing on the property, was not a local credit union. It was Bright Shore Private Bank. I sat back in my creaky office chair. Bright Shore was not a normal bank. You couldn't walk in off the street and open a checking account there. Bright Shore was a boutique lender for the ultra-wealthy. They handled private wealth management for HOAs with net worths north of 50 million. They were the bank of choice for the country club set. Why was a private wealth bank holding the mortgage on a crumbling townhouse block in the slums? I spent the next 3 weeks doing something I had not done since my Sunbridge training. I went hunting. I used my access to the Sunbridge proprietary database, which pulled from public property records, court filings, and UCC lien searches. I started mapping the Willow Creek empire. Not by looking at the shiny clubhouse they put on their website, but by looking at the dirt. I found a pattern. It was repetitive, systematic, and terrifyingly fragile. Here's how the scam worked. Willow Creek HOA would identify a depressed block. They would use an SPV like Summit Horizon to buy a building for cheap, say $2 million. They would spend $50,000 on cosmetic renovations, paint, lobby furniture, maybe a new sign, and then appraise the building at $5 million based on projected future fines. Then they would go to Bright Shore Private Bank. They would take out a loan for $4 million against that inflated appraisal. They would pay off the original $2 million purchase price and pocket the other $2 million as tax-free cash proceeds from the loan. They stripped the equity out of the building before the first resident even signed a covenant. But the devil was in the debt structure. I pulled the mortgage deeds. These weren't 30-year fixed loans. They were 5-year interest-only balloons with floating rates tied to SOFR. This meant 2 things. First, they weren't paying down any principal. They were just paying the interest every month. Second, if interest rates went up, their monthly payments would skyrocket. I built a massive spreadsheet. I called it the map. Column A was the property address. Column B was the SPV name. Column C was the lender. Row after row, the data filled the screen. 1400 Oak Street, lender Bright Shore. Davidian Complex, lender Bright Shore. Willow Creek Logistics Hub, lender Bright Shore. Victoria wasn't diversified. She was lazy. She had found a friendly loan officer at Bright Shore who was willing to rubber stamp these deals because the Willow Creek name was gold. She had concentrated almost 70% of the community debt with a single institution. The total outstanding principal across the portfolio I could trace was staggering. It was nearly $450 million, and almost all of it was floating rate debt. I looked at the dates. Most of these loans had been originated 3 or 4 years ago when interest rates were near zero. But now the Federal Reserve had been hiking rates aggressively to fight inflation. The cost of borrowing money had tripled in the last 18 months. I did the math in my head. If Willow Creek was paying 3% interest on $400 million a year ago, the annual debt service was $12 million, manageable. But at 7 or 8%, that payment jumped to $32 million a year. That was a $20 million hole in the cash flow. That explained why the Highland Arms was foreclosing. Victoria wasn't letting it go because she didn't care. She was letting it go because she couldn't afford to pay the mortgage on it anymore. She was sacrificing the small limbs to save the body. But I needed confirmation. I had the data, but I needed the narrative. I needed to know the temperature inside the room at Bright Shore. Luck, as Evelyn used to say, is just preparation meeting opportunity. The opportunity came in the form of a dull mandatory continuing education seminar on commercial credit risk held at a Marriott by the airport. I didn't want to go, but I needed the credits to keep my analyst certification active. During the coffee break, I found myself standing next to a young man in a suit that was slightly too tight. He was furiously typing on his phone and muttering under his breath. His name tag read Kevin, Senior Analyst, Bright Shore Private Bank. I moved in. I adjusted my posture to look less like a threat and more like a tired peer. Long day? I asked, pouring lukewarm coffee into a styrofoam cup. Kevin looked up, eyes bloodshot. You have no idea. If I have to re-underwrite one more distressed portfolio, I'm gonna jump off a bridge. I hear you, I lied. I'm in community lending. It's a mess out there. Community lending is cute, Kevin scoffed, taking the bait of superiority. Try managing a $3 billion private credit book when the prime rate just jumped again. My boss is screaming at us to offload exposure. We are sitting on so much bad paper it's not even funny. I took a sip of the terrible coffee. Bad paper. I thought Brightshore only dealt with the whales. Blue chip clients. Kevin laughed. A harsh, cynical sound. Whales are the worst. Rich girl. They are the most leveraged. They think because their last name is on the gate, they don't have to pay their debt service coverage ratio. We've got one client, massive HOA family, local royalty, who is technically in covenant default on 20 properties right now. But we haven't pulled the trigger because we're trying to bundle the debt and sell it quietly before we have to mark it down. My heart stopped. It literally skipped a beat. Selling it? I asked, keeping my voice casual. Who buys distressed debt in this market? Vulture funds, Kevin said, tossing his empty sugar packet into the trash. Private equity. Anyone with cash who wants to pick up assets for pennies on the dollar. We're packaging a trench right now. Project Icarus. We call it because this board flew way too close to the sun. Project Icarus. Willow Creek. Sounds intense, I said. It is a fire sale, Kevin confided, leaning in closer, lowering his voice. Between you and me, if we don't sell this package by the end of the quarter, our liquidity ratios are going to look ugly. We are desperate to get this off our books. I walked away from that coffee station with my hands trembling. I went straight to my car, skipped the second half of the seminar, and drove home. I sat on the floor of my townhouse surrounded by stacks of paper. I pulled up my spreadsheet. I looked at the maturity dates. Kevin had said covenant default. That was the key. In every commercial loan there are covenants, promises the borrower makes to the bank. The most common one is the debt service coverage ratio, or DSCR. It basically says that for every dollar of debt payment, the property must generate $1.25 of income. If the income drops or the debt payment rises and that ratio falls below 1.25, the bank can call the loan. They can demand full repayment of the entire $400 million immediately. Victoria's empire was generating cash. Sure. But with rates tripling, her debt payments had exploded. Her ratio wasn't 1.25. Based on my estimates, it was probably closer to 0.8. She was technically bankrupt. She was a zombie. She was walking around writing tickets, sneering at me, insulting my scrap money, but she was already dead. The only reason she hadn't fallen over yet was because Brightshore hadn't pushed her. But Brightshore was looking to sell the gun. If someone bought that debt package, if someone bought Project Icarus, they wouldn't just be buying a loan. They would be buying the right to foreclose on almost every major amenity the board owned. They would have the legal right to seize the clubhouse, the pools, the tennis courts, the gatehouse, and yes, the very house Victoria slept in. The buyer of that debt would control the Willow Creek empire. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. I could call her. That was the instinct of the resident I used to be. I could pick up the phone, call Victoria, and warn her. Vicky, Brightshore is trying to sell your debt. You need to refinance. You need to sell assets now. She might listen. She might not. She might laugh at me and tell me to go back to my little charity job. Or worse, she might fix it. She might raise fines on 1,000 residents, evict 1,000 more families like the ones at Highland Arms, and claw her way back to safety on the backs of the poor, just like she always did. I remembered Evelyn. I remembered her voice in the dark sunroom. Don't play a hand until you understand the table. I understood the table now. The table was rigged. Victoria had rigged it against her residents. And now the bank was rigging it against her. I looked at the check sitting on my desk, the monthly scrap money, $4,500 for years. That money had been a symbol of my subservience. It was the leash. But if I saved it, if I combined it with the capital I had been quietly building, if I could find the right partners, I wasn't just a recipient of charity anymore. I was a potential buyer. I didn't need to be rich enough to buy the buildings. I just needed to be smart enough to buy the paper. I opened a new tab on my browser. I searched for secondary market distressed debt brokers. I wasn't going to warn her. I wasn't going to save her. I was going to wait for Brightshore to put the package on the market. And when they did, I was going to be the first one in line. The image in my mind was crystal clear. It wasn't a violent revenge. It wasn't shouting or screaming. It was simply me sitting across a table from Victoria holding a piece of paper that said, I owned her mortgage. I turned off the laptop. The room was dark, illuminated only by the street lights outside. I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was the calm of a hunter who has finally spotted the prey in the crosshairs and realizes with a jolt of adrenaline that the wind is perfect. The knife was already at her throat. She just didn't know I was the one holding the handle. The idea for Northline did not begin in a glass-walled conference room with a whiteboard full of buzzwords. It began in the back booth of a diner at 11 at night over cold fries and a stack of legal pads. I was sitting across from Elias Thorne, a housing attorney who had spent the last 20 years fighting HOA evictions in court, and Sarah Jenkins, a retired bond trader who had grown a conscience late in life. We were an odd trio. Elias had the passion of a preacher but no money. Sarah had the money but no fire. I had both. We formed Northline Renewal Fund, a distressed debt vehicle that bought broken HOA loans and either fixed them or dismantled the corruption. Tonight, 8 years later, I sat in the same clubhouse where it had all started, watching Victoria raise her glass again, proposing a toast to the future. To the future? I whispered, my hand resting gently on the envelope of scrap money. I had the laptop in my leather portfolio, the one Derek had mocked as middle class only an hour ago. I pulled it out. Mr. Henderson, the HOA lawyer, stiffened immediately. Ms. Langford, I must object. We are in the middle of sensitive board negotiations. No recording devices, no electronics. This is highly irregular. Victoria looked at the laptop, then at me. She saw the challenge in my eyes. She was a gambler at heart, and she couldn't resist calling a bluff. Let her, Victoria said, gesturing with her fork. Let her open it. I want to see this. I want to see exactly what she thinks constitutes a fortune. Go ahead, Avery. Log in. Show us your savings account. Let's see if you have enough to cover the tip for this dinner. I opened the laptop. The screen glowed blue in the dim romantic lighting of the clubhouse. I could feel the eyes of the entire table on me. The waiters had sensed the tension and backed away into the shadows, watching like spectators at a blood sport. I connected to the secure hotspot on my phone. My fingers moved across the keyboard, typing in the complex 30-character password I used for my personal banking. Okay, I said, turning the laptop around so the screen faced the table. The first tab I opened was my standard personal checking and savings account at a national retail bank. This was the money I lived on, the money I had earned from my salary at Sunbridge plus the legitimate interest from my early bond investments. The screen refreshed. Total available balance, $342,550. A ripple of surprise went through the table. It wasn't millions, but it was significantly more than the scrap money they thought I survived on. Lana squinted at the screen, then let out a harsh, relieved giggle. Oh, wow, she said, clapping her hands mockingly. 30 grand? That's actually adorable. You've been saving your pennies, haven't you, Avery? That's almost enough for a down payment on a parking spot in my building. Is that the big reveal? You're not destitute. You're just middle class. She's right, Derek said, shaking his head. I make that in a quarterly bonus. Avery, you stopped the dinner to show us you have 6 figures. That's cute. Really? But it doesn't buy you a seat at the big table. Victoria looked relieved. She took a sip of wine, her shoulders relaxing. She had been scared for a second, but now order was restored. I was just a squirrel who had gathered a few extra nuts. Very good. Avery, Victoria said, her tone regaining its arrogance. You have been responsible. I am proud of you. Now, close the computer, sign the waiver, and let's get you that annuity. You can add it to your little nest egg. I'm not done, I said. I pulled the laptop back toward me. That was my checking account, I explained, my voice devoid of emotion. That's for groceries. This is for business. I opened a new browser window. I navigated to the institutional login portal for the Northline Renewal Fund's prime brokerage account. This wasn't a retail interface with colorful graphs and ads for credit cards. This was a stark black and white dashboard used by institutional traders. I keyed in the 2-factor authentication code from my phone. The screen loaded. I turned the laptop around again. The numbers were stark white against a black background. Portfolio value. Northline Renewal Fund Consolidated. General Partner Equity Stake, A. Thompson. The number next to my name wasn't 6 figures. It was $32,450,112, and underneath it in green the year-to-date return plus 18%. The silence that fell over the table this time was different. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a vacuum. It sucked the air out of the room. Lana's mouth was slightly open. She looked from the screen to me, then back to the screen, trying to find the trick. Derek leaned in so close his nose almost touched the pixels. He read the number. He read it again. He looked at the commas. He looked at the decimal point. What? Derek started, then cleared his throat. What is this? This is a simulator, right? This is a paper trading account. It is a live prime brokerage account. Derek, I said, do you want me to refresh the page? I reached over and hit Command R. The page reloaded. The number fluctuated slightly by a few hundred as the after-hours markets adjusted the bond valuations. It went up. Victoria was staring at the screen as if it were a ghost. Northline, Victoria whispered. Northline Renewal Fund. I have seen that name in the industry reports. Probably, I said. We have been very active lately. Derek finally found his voice. And it was defensive. Angry. He couldn't attack the number, so he attacked the source. Northline, he scoffed, sitting back and crossing his arms defensively. What is that? Some kind of woke hippie ESG fund? Is that what you do? You guilt-trip tech billionaires into donating money so you can build community gardens? That's not real finance. Avery. That's charity with a balance sheet. It is soft money. It disappears the moment the market gets tough. Soft money? I repeated, tasting the irony. Yeah, Derek continued, gaining momentum. It is a vanity project. You are managing money for people who want to feel good about themselves. But real finance, real estate, that is about leverage. That is about hard assets. You can't compare your little impact fund to what we do. We build perfection. You probably just lend money to, I don't know, organic bake sales. We don't lend to bake sales, I said. Then who? Marcus asked from the far end of the table. Who do you lend to if you have that much capital? Where is it parked? That is a great question, I said. I pulled the laptop back one last time. I think it is time you understood exactly what Northline does, I said. We don't buy stocks. We don't fund startups. We are a distressed debt fund. We buy non-performing commercial loans from banks that are desperate to clean up their balance sheets. Garbage collectors, Victoria sneered, finding a way to insult me even in the face of my success. You buy bad debt. You are a scavenger. I prefer the term recycler, I said. We buy broken things and we fix them or we dismantle them. I clicked on the tab labeled Active Loan Portfolio Trench B. This was the PDF document generated from the Brightshore sale. It listed every single borrower Northline currently held a mortgage against. Here is our current borrower list, I said. I turned the laptop around. The list was sorted by total loan value from highest to lowest. At the very top of the list, highlighted in the standard blue of the interface, was a name that everyone at the table knew better than their own street address. Borrower name, Willow Creek Estates HOA LLC. Collateral mixed-use portfolio. The clubhouse. The pools. The gatehouse. Status. Watch list. Covenant default. Principal balance, $110 million. The reaction was instantaneous. Victoria didn't just go pale. She turned a color I had never seen on a human being, a waxy grayish yellow. It was the color of a woman whose heart had just skipped 3 beats in a row. She stared at the name Willow Creek Estates HOA. She looked at the lender name at the top of the sheet, Northline Renewal Fund. She looked at me. No, Victoria rasped. Her voice was gone. It was just a breathy wheeze. No, that is impossible. Brightshore holds that paper. I spoke to them last week. They said they assigned it to an institutional partner. They did, I said. We are the institutional partner. You, Victoria stood up, knocking her wine glass over. The dark red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like a gunshot wound, dripping onto the floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. You bought my debt. You are the one squeezing us. I am the one holding the paper. Victoria, I said. Derek looked like he was going to be sick. He was doing the math in his head. He was realizing that every arrogant text message he had sent me, every joke about scrap money, every sneer about my cute little job had been delivered to the person who now held the power to liquidate his entire board bonus. But why? Lana stammered, her voice trembling. Why would you do that? You are part of the community. Exactly, I said. I am part of the community, and for years I watched this community operate. I watched you leverage everything to the hilt. I watched you extract value from residents and discard them. I watched you treat debt like a game you couldn't lose because you thought you were too big to fail. I pointed at the screen. But the math changed. Lana, interest rates went up and you didn't adapt. You kept spending. You kept bragging. And Brightshore got scared. They wanted out. They wanted to sell your debt to anyone who would take it. I looked at Victoria. She was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. You should be happy, Victoria, I said. If a private equity firm from New York had bought this package, they would have filed for foreclosure yesterday. They wouldn't have come to dinner. They would have sent a sheriff. You can't foreclose, Victoria sputtered, trying to find her footing. We have rights. We have a forbearance agreement. You have a covenant breach, I corrected her, tapping the screen where the status read. Your debt service coverage ratio dropped below 1.0 last quarter. Technically, the loan is callable right now. I could demand the full $110 million by Monday morning. Victoria sank back into her chair. She looked small. For the first time in my life, the giant who had cast a shadow over my entire existence looked small. You are Northline, she whispered as if trying to make the words fit in her mouth. I am Northline, I confirmed. And Northline isn't a charity. We expect a return on our investment. I looked around the table. The aunts were terrified. The cousins were silent. Henderson, the lawyer, was frantically typing on his phone, presumably checking the corporate registry for Northline to confirm what he already knew was true. So, I said, closing the laptop with a soft click. Now that we have established that I am not destitute, and that I am, in fact, your primary creditor, I think we can stop talking about my allowance. I think we should talk about yours. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen down the hall. What do you want? Derek asked. His voice was cracked, broken. He wasn't the vice president anymore. He was the hostage. I want to renegotiate, I said. But not for me. For the residents. The residents? Victoria looked up, confusion warring with her fear. We will get to that, I said. But first, I want everyone to understand the new reality. That check you gave me, the $4,500, I picked up the envelope again. That is the interest payment on about 3 minutes of the debt you owe me. You are paying me, Victoria. You have been paying me for months. You just didn't know it. I looked at the stain of wine spreading on the tablecloth. Now, I said, leaning forward, let's look at the terms of surrender. The spilled wine was seeping into the tablecloth, a dark, spreading bruise on the pristine white fabric. But no one called for a waiter. The air in the private ballroom was thick enough to choke on. Victoria Langford was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white, trying to reinflate an ego that had just been punctured by cold, hard math. 110 million, Victoria muttered, shaking her head as if shaking off a bad dream. Then she looked up, her eyes narrowing into that familiar, predatory squint. This is absurd. Even if this Northline entity holds some of our paper, it is a fraction, a blip. Our portfolio is valued at over 2 billion. This debt is a rounding error. She stood up straighter, smoothing her blazer, attempting to reconstruct her authority brick by brick. And you, she pointed a finger at me, a tremble of rage beneath her voice. You are just a front. There is no way a community lender holds the primary position on my assets. Brightshore wouldn't sell a debt of this magnitude to a nobody. You are a middleman, Avery. You are holding the bag for someone else. Who is it? BlackRock? Apollo? Stop pretending you are the one pulling the strings. I am not a middleman, Victoria, I said, my voice steady against her rising volume. And it is not a rounding error. It is a noose. I reached into my leather portfolio again. I pulled out a stapled document, heavy and authoritative. It wasn't a spreadsheet this time. It was a contract. I slid it across the glass surface of the Lazy Susan toward Mr. Henderson. Read the assignment agreement, Mr. Henderson, I said. Page 3, clause 4. Transfer of beneficial interest. Henderson, sweat beading on his forehead, picked up the document, his hands shaking slightly. He flipped to the page. He adjusted his glasses. Well, Victoria barked. Tell her she is delusional. Henderson, tell her she is just a service agent. Henderson swallowed hard. He looked up at Victoria, his face the color of old parchment. It is valid, Victoria, Henderson whispered. This is a full assignment of debt. Brightshore Private Bank has transferred all rights, title, and interest in the Project Icarus loan portfolio to Northline Renewal Fund. There is no other beneficiary. Northline owns the note. They own the mortgage. They own the liens. Read the signatory line, I commanded. Henderson flipped to the back. Signed by the Managing Director of Brightshore and for Northline Renewal Fund. Signed by Avery Elizabeth Thompson, Managing Partner. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressed against our eardrums. You own it, Victoria whispered, sinking back into her chair. The fight was draining out of her, replaced by a horrifying comprehension. You actually own it. Let me put it in terms you will understand. Victoria, I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. Every month, your finance department sends a wire transfer for debt service. That money doesn't go to Brightshore anymore. It goes to a routing number that I control. You are paying me the scrap money you handed me tonight. That $4,500? That is barely a fraction of the interest you paid me yesterday. Derek slammed his fist onto the table. The cutlery jumped. This is betrayal, he shouted, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. You are sick, Avery. You took everything we gave you, the access, the name, the community, and you used it to stab us in the back. You used the knowledge you learned inside this clubhouse to destroy it. I didn't destroy anything, Derek. I shot back, my voice sharpening. I saved it from being sold to a vulture fund that would have stripped it for parts. And don't talk to me about betrayal. Betrayal is evicting a single mother over a $12 fee. Betrayal is hiding toxic debt in shell companies to fool your residents. I used the knowledge I learned here. Yes. But I didn't use it to exploit people. I used it to fix the mess you made. You are a parasite, Derek spat. You are nothing but a... I am your banker, I interrupted, my voice cracking like a whip. And in this community, according to Victoria, the one with the gold makes the rules. Isn't that right? I turned back to the laptop, clicking on a new tab. Now, let's talk about those rules because right now you are breaking them. I opened the loan covenants document. I highlighted a paragraph in yellow. Clause 7.2. Acceleration upon insolvency or breach of ratio. I read aloud. If the borrower's debt service coverage ratio falls below 1.25 for 2 consecutive quarters, the lender, that is me, has the right to demand immediate repayment of the full principal balance, or the lender may take possession of the collateral assets to satisfy the debt. I looked at Victoria. Your ratio was 0.8 last quarter. It is projected to be 0.7 this quarter. I can take the clubhouse. I can take the pools. I can take the gatehouse. I can take them tomorrow. You wouldn't, Lana gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. That is our community. That is my social life. It was your community, I corrected her. Now it is my collateral. I scrolled down to another section. Clause 8.4. Prohibition on asset transfer. I continued. If the borrower attempts to move assets out of the holding company to avoid liability, like say restructuring the board trust to hide equity, which is exactly what you plan to do tonight, that is an event of default. If you had signed those papers Henderson brought, I would have had the legal right to seize the keys to the clubhouse by Monday morning. Victoria looked at Henderson. Henderson nodded miserably. She is right, Victoria. The bad boy carve-outs and the loan, if we try to move assets, personal liability triggers. They could come after your personal estate, the house in the Hamptons, the art collection, everything. You trapped us, Victoria whispered. You sat there. You let us plan this dinner. You let us invite you knowing you had a gun to our heads. I learned from the best, I said coldly, my eyes locking with hers. Remember the fine-to-own scheme, Victoria? Remember how you told me it was perfectly legal because the residents signed the covenant? You said if they couldn't read the fine print, that was natural selection. I tapped the contract on the table. Well, you signed this. You signed the floating rate loans with Brightshore. You chose to leverage your community to the hilt because you were greedy and you thought rates would stay at 0 forever. You weren't tricked. You weren't scammed. You just made a bad bet. And now I am the house collecting on that bet. My mother, who had been silent the entire meal, staring at her unmoving hands, suddenly spoke up. Her voice was thin, trembling, stripped of its usual socialite polish. Avery, she said, looking up with watery eyes. What are you going to do? Are you going to ruin us? Are you going to treat us like those people, the residents? The room went still. That was the core fear. They were terrified that I would treat them exactly the way they had treated thousands of others. I looked at her. I saw the fear in her eyes. The fear of losing status, of losing comfort, of becoming ordinary. No, Mom, I said softly. I am not going to treat you like residents because residents don't deserve what you did to them. I clicked on the final tab on my screen. It was a gallery of photos. This is what Northline does, I said. The screen showed a building, a modest brick apartment complex. It was clean. There were flower boxes in the windows. A sign out front read, "Managed by Northline, community owned." "We bought the debt on this building 3 years ago," I explained. "The landlord was a slumlord. He wanted to evict everyone and sell the land for condos. We bought the note. We forced a restructuring. We kept the families in their homes. We kept the rent increases at inflation. And guess what? The building is profitable. The returns are lower than what you chase. Sure, we only make 6%, not 20, but nobody is homeless." I cycled to another photo, a community center, not unlike the clubhouse, but with a banner that said, "Living wage employer." "We restructured the debt on this center," I said. "Part of the deal was that the operator had to agree to a living wage standard for the staff. Productivity went up. Turnover went down. It is a stable asset." I looked back at my board. "I am going to do to you exactly what I did to them. I am going to force you to be responsible. I am going to force you to stop strip mining your community and start actually running it." "You can't dictate how I run my community," Victoria shouted, finding a sudden burst of desperate energy. "I built this. I am Victoria Langford. I will sue you. I will hire every litigator in the state. I will tie this up in court for 10 years. You will never see a dime." "Go ahead," I said, unbothered. "Sue me. But remember, Mr. Henderson just confirmed the contract is valid. And while you are suing me, the interest clock is ticking. The default interest rate is 12%. Every day you fight me, your equity shrinks. By the time we get to trial, you won't just be broke. Victoria, you will be owing me money." I leaned back, crossing my legs. "And do you really want discovery?" I asked. "Do you really want my forensic accountants going through 20 years of your SPVs? Do you want the IRS looking at Summit Horizon Partners? Do you want the press to know that the great Victoria Langford is being foreclosed on by her own resident because she couldn't pay her bills?" Victoria froze. The threat of exposure was far more potent than the threat of poverty. She lived on her reputation. If the world knew she was insolvent, her social capital would evaporate overnight. "So," I said, "we have 2 choices. Option A, we go to court. I accelerate the debt. I seize the assets. I sell the shiny clubhouse to pay off the loan. And you all start looking for jobs on LinkedIn." I paused, letting the horror of that image sink in. "Or option B," I said, "we restructure right now, tonight." Derek looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Restructure? What does that mean? What do we have to do?" "It means the party is over, Derek," I said. "It means the private jets go, the bonuses go, the dividend payments stop until the principal is paid down. It means we convert a portion of the luxury amenities into affordable housing to stabilize the tax credits. It means you stop running this community like a casino and start running it like a neighborhood that serves its residents." "You want us to become you?" Lana whispered, horrified. "I want you to become solvent," I said. "And if that means you have to live a little more like me and a little less like Marie Antoinette, then yes, that is the price of the bailout." I picked up the scrap money check one last time. I held it between my fingers. "You tried to buy my silence with $4,500, I said. "But the price of admission just went up. The new price is your ego." I looked at Victoria. She was slumped in her chair, defeated. The queen was dead. Long live the creditor. "So, Victoria," I asked, my voice soft but unyielding, "do you want to see the term sheet? Or should I call the sheriff?" The waiter hovered near the entrance of the private ballroom, holding a bottle of sparkling water like a weapon he was unsure how to use. The spilled wine had stopped spreading, settling into a dark, Permanent stain on the white linen, a perfect metaphor for the reputation of the Willow Creek board. In that moment, I reached into my leather portfolio one last time. The bag, which Derek had mocked as middle class only an hour ago, was now the most terrifying object in the room. I pulled out a bound document, thicker than the others. It was spiral-bound with a clear plastic cover, the kind used for board meetings and audit reports. I placed it in the center of the table. I did not spin it this time. I let it sit there, a monolith of data. This, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence, is the full statement. It is not just a snapshot of what you owe today. It is a projection of what is going to happen to you over the next 6 months. Victoria stared at the document but did not touch it. She looked like a woman who had found a bomb on her doorstep and was afraid that breathing too hard might set it off. "What is in there?" she whispered. "The future," I answered. "Specifically, the cash flow covenants you are about to breach in 45 days. Based on my analysis of your internal revenue streams, which I now have access to as your senior lender, you are going to miss the interest payment on the clubhouse in January. In February, the balloon payment for the Southside development comes due. You do not have the cash to cover either." I leaned back, crossing my hands in my lap. "So, we have reached the end of the road. Victoria, the bridge is out. You have 2 choices and I'm going to be very clear about them because I do not want you to say later that you did not understand the terms." I held up one finger. Option 1 is the painful one. We call it restructuring. You sign a binding memorandum of understanding with Northline tonight. We agree to a forbearance period. We pause the foreclosure. In exchange, Willow Creek HOA undergoes a radical diet. You sell the corporate jet. You sell the vacation estate in Aspen. You liquidate the non-core luxury assets to pay down the principal balance. "You want me to sell the jet?" Derek choked out, looking as if I had asked him to cut off a limb. "How are we supposed to do business? We have meetings in London. You have Zoom," I interrupted coldly. "It is free. Use it," I continued, ignoring his outrage. "Furthermore, the restructuring includes a mandate to convert 30% of your residential portfolio into long-term affordable housing. You will cap fine increases. You will stop the evictions for minor infractions. And to fund this, we are cutting executive compensation. No bonuses for the board for 3 years. The dividend to the family trust is suspended indefinitely." "You are gutting us?" Lana cried, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "No dividends. How am I supposed to pay my mortgage? I just signed for the loft." "Get a roommate," I suggested. "I hear the market is tight." I held up a second finger. "Option 2 is the nuclear one. You refuse to sign. You walk out of here holding on to your pride. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., Northline files a notice of default. We accelerate the debt. We publicly seize control of the assets. The market realizes Willow Creek is insolvent. Your stock price, if you had any, goes to 0. The other banks panic and call in their loans. You spend the next 10 years in bankruptcy court. And every single email you ever wrote about extracting value from poor residents becomes public record during discovery." I looked at Victoria. "Those are the doors, Victoria. Door number 1 is humiliation and reform. Door number 2 is annihilation. Choose." Victoria was trembling. It was a physical vibration that rattled the silverware near her hand. Her face was purple. "This is blackmail," she hissed. "This is emotional blackmail. You are using your position to punish us because you felt left out. You are a petulant child throwing a tantrum with a checkbook." "It is not blackmail," I replied, my voice devoid of anger. "It is financial consequence. It is the exact same logic you used when you told that mother she had to leave her apartment because she was $12 short. You told her it wasn't personal. It was just the contract. Well, this is the contract. Victoria, I am just refusing to play the role of the failure anymore. I am refusing to live on scraps while you feast on debt. Derek stood up. He walked around the table, coming to stand next to me. He put a hand on my shoulder. It was meant to be comforting, but it felt clammy and desperate. Avery, listen, Derek said, his voice dropping to that slick salesman tone he used when he was trying to close a bad deal. Let's take a breath. We are community. Blood is thicker than water, right? Look, clearly, you have proven your point. You are smart. We get it. You won. He squeezed my shoulder. Let's do a soft deal. Forget the restructuring. Forget the affordable housing nonsense that kills our margins. Instead, you just come back to the fold. You sign your Northline equity over to the board trust. We merge the entities. And in exchange, we bump you up. No more scrap money. We put you on the board. We give you a salary, $500,000 a year, plus a signing bonus. We buy you an apartment, a real one. You can be one of us. Avery, the prodigal resident, returns. I looked at his hand on my shoulder. I looked at his face, sweating and eager. He truly believed that everyone had a price. He believed that the only reason I was doing this was because I wanted to be them. I reached up and removed his hand from my shoulder as if it were a piece of lint. You still don't understand, I said softly. I don't want to be you, Derek. I despise what you are. You think this is a negotiation for a better allowance. I'm not selling Northline. I didn't build it to get rich. I built it to fix the damage you caused. I am not going to sell out the families in those buildings just so you can keep flying private. You are insane, Derek shouted, backing away. You are burning down the house to kill a spider. The house is already burning. Derek, I snapped. I am the only one holding a fire hose. She is right. The voice came from the far end of the table. It was quiet, shaky, but distinct. We all turned. It was Aunt Linda. Linda was Victoria's younger sister for 30 years. She had been a silent beneficiary of the trust, nodding along with Victoria, laughing at her jokes, collecting her checks. She had never spoken up, not once. Linda, Victoria asked, confused. What did you say? Linda took off her glasses. She looked tired. She looked at the spilled wine, then at me, then at her sister. I remember, Linda said, her voice gaining a little strength. I remember when we were kids, Victoria, before the empire, before the gates. Mom used to say that if you make $1 by hurting a neighbor, you actually lost $2. We forgot that. Linda, be quiet, Victoria warned. You don't understand the finances. I understand enough, she said. I saw the news about the evictions last year. I saw the protests. I felt sick. Victoria, I just didn't say anything because I was afraid you would cut me off just like you cut Avery off. She looked at me. If Avery has a way to save the community without throwing more people onto the street, I think we should listen. I don't need the jet. Victoria, I don't need the dividends if it means we are destroying people. I am tired of being ashamed of our name. Ashamed, Victoria roared. I made you rich. I gave you everything. You gave us money, Linda said quietly. And you took our spines. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't fearful. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. The board consensus that Victoria relied on, the idea that they were a united front against the world, had shattered. Mr. Henderson, I said, turning to the lawyer, you are a pragmatic man. What is your legal opinion if we go to court? What happens? Henderson wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked at Victoria, apologetic but firm. Victoria, if Northline accelerates the debt, they are within their rights. The covenants are clear. In a courtroom, a judge will look at the debt service coverage ratio and grant them summary judgment. And he paused, lowering his voice. Avery is right about discovery. If they subpoena the records of the SPVs, if they look at how we capitalize those shell companies, could trigger a fraud investigation by the SEC. It would be a bloodbath. Victoria slumped. It was a physical collapse. The air went out of her chest. Her shoulders rounded. In seconds, she aged 10 years. She looked at Derek, who was staring at the floor. She looked at Lana, who was weeping silently into her napkin. She looked at Linda, who was refusing to meet her eyes. She was alone. The jet, Victoria whispered. We really have to sell the jet. And the Aspen house, I added. And the yacht? You need liquidity. Victoria, you have been living on credit for too long. It is time to pay the bill. Victoria reached out a trembling hand. Give me the pen. Henderson slid the memorandum of understanding across the table. It was a simple document, just 3 pages, but it marked the end of the Willow Creek Empire as they knew it. Victoria held the pen. She hesitated. She looked at me one last time. There was no love in her eyes, but there was something else. Fear and perhaps, for the first time, recognition. She was finally seeing me. You are just like Evelyn, she muttered. She always said quiet money was dangerous. Sign it, Victoria, I said. She signed. The scratch of the pen against the paper was the loudest sound in the world. Then she pushed the document toward me. I signed below her name. Avery Elizabeth Thompson, Managing Partner, Northline Renewal Fund. It was done. I picked up the executed agreement and handed it to Henderson. File this in the morning. If I see any deviation from these terms, any asset transfers, any unauthorized bonuses, the deal is void and I foreclose. Do I make myself clear? Crystal clear. MS. Thompson, Henderson said, treating me with a deference he had never shown before. I stood up. My legs felt steady. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, exhausting calm. I looked down at the table. There, sitting next to my net worth statement, was the white envelope, the scrap money, the check for $4,500. I picked it up. You know, I said, looking at the check. For a long time, I thought this money was a lifeline. I thought I needed it. I ripped the check in half. The sound was sharp, like a bone snapping. I ripped the halves again. I let the pieces flutter down onto the table. They landed on top of the net worth statement, covering the line that showed my $32 million balance. From today on, I said, I don't need crumbs. I don't need your scraps. If I ever accept a single dollar from this community again, it will be principal repayment on the debt you owe me, and every cent of it will go straight into the fund to keep people in their homes. I picked up my leather portfolio. I slid my laptop inside. I zipped it up. I turned to the waiter who was still standing in the shadows looking terrified and fascinated. Excuse me, I said. The waiter jumped. Yes, ma'am. The bill for the table, I said. Bring it to me. Avery, you don't have to. My mother started, her voice weak. I insist, I said. The waiter brought the black leather folder. I didn't look at the total. It was probably $2,000, a week's wages for some of my residents. I pulled out a sleek metal card. It was matte black on the front, etched in silver. It said Northline Renewal Fund. I placed the card in the folder. Categorize it as client acquisition expense. I waited for him to run the card. The machine beeped. Approved. I took my receipt. I looked back at the table one last time. They were all sitting there, frozen in the wreckage of their reality. They were surrounded by crystal glasses and expensive food. But they looked impoverished. They were looking at the torn pieces of the check and the statement that proved their resident owned them. They weren't just looking at numbers. They were looking at a ledger of their own greed, their own arrogance, and the precise moment where the balance had tipped. Good night, I said. I turned and walked out of the private ballroom. I walked through the main dining room, past the people laughing and drinking, oblivious to the coup that had just happened behind the velvet curtains. I walked out into the cool night air of the subdivision. I took a deep breath. It smelled of fresh-cut grass, distant rain, and freedom. I checked my phone. I had a notification from the Northline system. Payment received. $4,500. Interest payment processed. I smiled. I hailed a cab. I wasn't going to a penthouse. I was going back to my townhouse with the clanking radiator. But tonight, for the first time, it wouldn't feel small. It would feel like headquarters. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I am dying to know where in the world are you tuning in from right now. Please drop your location in the comments below so we can see how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed seeing Avery turn the tables on the HOA Karen, please make sure to subscribe to the HOA Revenge Stories channel. Smash that like button and hit the bell so more people can hear this story. See you in the next one.